I'm Chuck Strozier. I want to welcome you to our Friday seminar. And it's a real honor and pleasure to introduce Paul Pillar, who's one of the most distinguished voices in American foreign policy and counterterrorism, and has been for really a number of years. He has now a non-resident appointment at Georgetown. He was taught there before, but now he's, I guess, formally retired. After many years. He's also associated with Brookings, but was involved in a 28-year career in the U.S. intelligence agency, including the long stint in the CIA, was chief of the analytic units, so was a major figure shaping CIA work and policy. Later was with the National Intelligence Council. Earlier, many years ago, he served in Vietnam, so he has a military background as well, and has been the author of 4 books. Most recently, this Misunderstanding, Why America Misunderstands the World, National Experience and Roots of Misperception, which I think will be related to the topic of his talk. And we have, incidentally, we have some copies for sale afterwards at a cut rate price of this book. In fact, I think the retail price is something like $35. We're going to sell it for $21.65. Now we're not going to have a raffle, but it is available, and you know, any author, it's a great narcissistic pleasure to sign books. So we will end a little earlier so we can have our wine and cheese, and also some of you can buy the book and then get him to sign it before he has to catch a plane. So, Paul Pillar, thank you.
Thanks very much, Charles, and thank you for promoting the book too. But, that's not the main reason I'm here. The advertised topic is terrorism and current foreign policy issues, so I will be sticking to that. We'll get into some of the really current ones that you read about in the front page every day, but really anything is fair game when we get into questions and discussions in terms of terrorism, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of other things I've been involved with. Terrorism, and I think this probably applies to the way some of you have approached it in courses here, it tends to be looked at as an entire policy area, or to the extent that it gets grouped with another major area of public policy, it tends to be homeland security, more so than foreign policy, even though we are dealing for the most part with international terrorism. I would argue that there has been at least as much intertwining between terrorism and counterterrorist policy and foreign policy problems as there has been with those homeland security issues that terrorism tends to get grouped with, both on the threat side and on the response side. And I would suggest it's absolutely impossible to deal effectively and to discuss effectively current problems of international terrorism without getting immediately into foreign policy issues that get into other equities and objectives and interests of the United States. And conversely, there are other important foreign policy objectives that are significantly affected by both terrorism and what we do on the counterterrorist side. So that's kind of the conceptual framework that I'm applying to this. It's not just the current issues, it's the past issues as well. If you look at what you could call the beginning of modern international terrorism, the way my colleague Bruce Hoffman defines it, which is to say going back to about the late 60s, when we had violence that was mostly centered in the Middle East, with groups like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. It was centered first and foremost around the Palestinian issue, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so it was an integral part of that conflict, and any policy issue with regard to what should we do or what should anyone do about that aspect of terrorism couldn't be separated from that larger Israeli-Palestinian issue. And then later measures to try to address that issue, the Oslo process of the 1990s, took some of these groups like Fatah basically out of the terrorist business, but then we still had others to deal with who were rejectionists. The tie between the larger issue and the strictly terrorism issues was never broken. And then more recently, when we started worrying about Osama bin Laden, as probably many of you in this room are aware, where he first became really radicalized and set off on his violent route was in the 1990s, after Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And Desert Shield was our beefing up of military forces in the peninsula, and in particular in Saudi Arabia. And for bin Laden, seeing the boots of the infidel marring the sand in his home kingdom, Saudi Arabia, was the most radicalizing event in his personal history. That had to do with the foreign policy problem of what to do about the Iraqi seizure of Kuwait. And then you also had the events in Afghanistan, which we're still seized with. The whole Afghan war against the Soviets, starting in 1979 and through most of the 1980s. A big part of the Cold War. It was seen as a Cold War issue here in the United States. But it was a very important episode in laying the groundwork for, or being closely related to later issues of international terrorism as it affected groups like Al-Qaeda. And of most pertinent to some of the current problems, we had the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. For a set of objectives we don't need to take time to go into, but they weren't terrorism ones. And yet among the major results have been the emergence of the group that was initially known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and with some changes in leadership and name, it became ISIS. I'm going to call it ISIS, by the way, although I noticed that Secretary Kerry has gone from ISIL, the U.S. government term that's been used up to this point, to Daesh. But ISIS, I think, is familiar to most people. So it never ends. We're dealing mainly with foreign policy issues if we're trying to do something about international terrorism. But let me just say one more thing in terms of background. State sponsorship. Something really state-sponsored, state-fomented terrorism. We used to worry a lot about that 25, 30 years ago. Going back to the 1980s, you had governments like those in Libya, Syria, as well as Iran, North Korea, and others who were doing a lot of really nasty terrorist stuff. Most of them have stopped doing that stuff. We still have 3 governments on the official list of state sponsors of terrorism, but that's a very politicized list that doesn't really reflect necessary reality. The big change over these last 3 decades or so in terms of the decline in state sponsorship has been 2 things overall. One, the end of the Cold War, and the fact that regimes like those in Libya and Syria no longer had the Soviets to go to for support and trade and arms and so on. And that made a difference in their calculations with regard to whether they felt they could be seen as a terrorist state in the eyes of the West. And secondly, globalization and everything that's implied by that economically as well as politically, which simply means the opportunity costs for being a pariah and being sanctioned and ostracized are that much greater than they used to be. Well, you got a whole set of foreign policy issues there. Cold War, ending the Cold War, what to do about globalization. And it was very closely related to a major change in the shape of international terrorism, in the sense that state sponsorship and direct state fomenting of terrorism, which was a big part of it as recently as 30 years ago, is a very small part of it today. Let me turn directly to some of the current issues, those front page ones that you read about, particularly involving the so-called Islamic State, or ISIS. And I think an initial observation, an optimistic one in my view, is ISIS has no foreign allies, certainly among governments. So as in that respect, it doesn't present a serious foreign policy problem. We're not worried about some patron or sponsor of it, relations with whom any actions against ISIS are going to be a complication. Not so. But there have been different relative priorities of different governments with regard to dealing with ISIS, and that is a foreign policy problem for us. Specifically, some of the Persian Gulf Arabs, looking at a situation like Syria, have seemed to have been more focused on trying to oust the Assad regime in that very complicated situation than on countering ISIS. And certainly then on countering more radical Sunni tendencies generally in the Syrian opposition, which includes not only ISIS but others. The ISIS problem today is very much wrapped up in the civil wars of both Iraq and Syria. As I mentioned, the group really came into being as a result of the war in Iraq, and then after having a period in which it was not doing so well, but it was never killed off, it took advantage of the outbreak of civil war in Syria about 5 years ago to expand out of Iraq into Syria, take advantage of the chaos there, and we have the situation that we are dealing with today. It is impossible to talk about resolving either of these continuing civil wars in both Iraq and Syria in a really comprehensive way and in a final way without also talking about ISIS. Iraq is, relatively speaking, the simpler of the two situations. Whatever continuing appeal ISIS has among Sunni Iraqis has much to do with Sunni perceptions of the fairness and inclusiveness, or lack thereof, on the part of the Shia-dominated government in Baghdad. That has been the set of issues around which Sunni Iraqi resistance and violence has revolved, and that ISIS has exploited. So that part of the ISIS problem depends on the directions and the orientation and the performance of the government in Baghdad. That's an internal domestic problem for Iraqis. It is a foreign policy problem for us and for other outside powers like the Europeans. With regard to the nature of our relationship with Baghdad, carrots and sticks that we might use, the particular things that we want to try to press the current Prime Minister Abadi to do or not to do. Overall, the situation in that regard has improved somewhat over the last couple of years, particularly with the transition from Maliki, the previous Prime Minister, who turned out to be more of a hardline sectarian kind of guy and more of an authoritarian sort of guy than many of us might have hoped for. Abadi is trying to do something different in terms of the inclusiveness versus authoritarian nature, and in terms of the something less than rigidly sectarian behavior. Nonetheless, the challenges clearly are still there, and there's a significant amount of distrust on the part of Iraqi Sunni Arabs that has to be dealt with. But it is an improved situation, as reflected in some of the changes on the ground, the recapture of some of the territory that ISIS had seized in 2014, and most recently the recapture of Ramadi and Tikrit, and now we read about the gearing up to try to recapture the second biggest Iraqi city, namely Mosul. But this keeps getting us back into some of these foreign policy problems. I just mentioned the campaign against Mosul. One of the continuing issues, again an internal issue for Iraq, a foreign policy issue for us, has to do with the relations of the Kurds in the north of Iraq with the rest of the country. And in particular, where you draw the lines between semi-autonomous Iraqi Kurdistan and the rest of the country. And one of the things that's been happening over the last year and a half or so has been that as some of the ground has been recaptured from ISIS, the Kurds have, through their Peshmerga militia, have done the best they can to try to gain control of areas that were either previously contested or that the Kurds had their eyes on all along, even though they might have been largely Arab inhabited, to extend the lines of Iraqi Kurdistan. And I'll say when, not if, I'm confident this will happen sometime this year, when Mosul is recaptured from ISIS, and it's going to be a long, difficult slog, this set of issues is going to figure very prominently in terms of the ethnic distribution of territory and resources in Iraq. It's a problem for our policymakers that really has never really been solved. But to the extent that the ISIS problem is improved over the course of this year, as I think it will be further improved, this problem will rear its head even in more acute form than before. Finally, as far as the Iraq side is concerned, this is also one of the areas of most significant parallel interests between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran. We are both against ISIS. We are both in favor of supporting the incumbent regime in Baghdad. Both sides have been very hesitant about any upfront cooperation because it's a matter of political sensitivity in both capitals. But they are the two biggest outside powers opposing ISIS in Iraq now. You know, the Russians haven't gotten involved in Iraq in the way that they did in Syria. And this is a whole set of issues that has had quite a bit of sensitivity here in Washington politics with regard, in the wake of the nuclear agreement, you know, what sort of relationship we ought to have with Iran. If you've got hang-ups about that, then you'd be uncomfortable about the tacit cooperation. If you're focused more on doing something about the ISIS problem on the Iraq side, then you ought to be happy about the fact that the other biggest outside participant is basically on the same side that we are on that. Now, Syria is the more complicated place, complicated though Iraq is, given the multi-dimensional and very messy civil war that's been going on there for the last 5 years, and in which the players are so complicated that no scorecard that you have could simplify it for you, and the scorecard would probably be out of date given the mixing and matching and evolution of the various groups that are part of that war. Just as the civil war in Syria gave ISIS its big opportunity to expand out of Iraq in a big way, so too the continued war helps to sustain it, if for no other reason than a lot of the contending factions that otherwise might be fighting ISIS have been fighting each other. Now, I think it's only very recently that we can start to be a little more optimistic about the quandary that poses. And I preface these comments by saying there's still plenty to be pessimistic about in Syria. You know, I've said a number of times in the last year or so, I wouldn't be surprised to see the Syrian civil war, if it trundles on for a decade or so, like the Lebanese civil war did in the 1970s and 80s. I hope not. And there are some more bases for hopes that have come up more recently. The partial ceasefire, the cessation of hostilities, that was basically the result of a negotiation between Russia and the United States, has been holding over the last month or so better than most people had expected. And now, and I would describe this as supporting the concept of the ceasefire holding, partial ceasefire, and leading to more success in the political negotiations that are going on right now, mediated by the UN mediator for Syria, Mr. Stefan de Mistura, was the news just of a week or so ago, the announcement by the Russians that they were drawing down their forces. I think we ought to look at that favorably, not in the sort of crude Cold War way that has been commented on so much, that, you know, the more that the Russians do, the worse it is for us, the less the Russians do, the better it is for us. No, that's not the framework I'm using here. I'm thinking about what are the conditions that would make some kind of negotiated compromise settlement of at least the portion of this war that does not include ISIS and the al-Nusra Front and others that we would all call terrorists. What are the conditions that would make that more likely? And one of those key conditions, my friend Bill Zartman is the kind of the IR theorist who's written most about this in the past, is a hurting stalemate. The prospect that neither side, or any side if you got more than two, has the possibility of achieving a military victory, of getting its objectives solely through arms. And so the only alternative to endless warfare would be a negotiated settlement. I think we are closer to those conditions today than we were certainly at the time the Russians intervened back around last September, or about a few months before that, in the middle of last year. When the Russians intervened, it looked like, and there was a lot of commentary to this effect, that the Assad regime was getting so shaky that it might collapse, in a matter of weeks, if not days. That made a lot of people very happy, but I think we shouldn't be happy about it, because what it did was to feed the hopes of some of the opposition groups that they could achieve a military victory. And that as long as they got some outside material support and the peace negotiators stayed out of the way, they could cause this regime to collapse completely, and they had achieved more of a victory than they could at the negotiating table. Given what the Russians and some of the outside supporters, which mainly means the Iranians and Hezbollah, have done, that situation is no longer the case, and the Russian intervention was key to that. There's been a bunch of surprise expressed over the last few days about exactly what Putin is doing. I don't think we should have been surprised at all. Certainly, once Russian forces were in, what was basically accomplished was, and these seem to be his goals in intervening last year, propping up the Assad regime enough and just enough so that it wasn't going to be about to collapse, as well as other objectives having to do with Russia, making its mark and making sure it had a place at the table and all those sorts of things. There have been some just over the last couple of days, hints of the talks, the proximity talks in Geneva, to the extent, to the effect that some progress is being made. So I am personally more hopeful about the situation than I've been for most of the last year and a half. But as I say, hasten to add, there's still plenty of reasons for pessimism. And one of the main complications and reasons for pessimism is the fact that the cessation of hostilities is only a partial ceasefire. By agreement, it does not cover ISIS, and it does not cover the al-Nusra Front, and it doesn't cover, beyond those two, some others that at least we and the Russians could agree are terrorists. And the problem with that is, especially with the al-Nusra Front, a lot of their fighters have been closely intermingled with the so-called moderates that we've taken a more favorable view toward. And if the rules of the partial ceasefire are, well, you can't fire at the moderates anymore, but you can still keep shooting, they being or you being the Assad regime, or even the Russians, at the terrorists, it's going to be very hard as a practical matter on the ground to disentangle the two. And so there are major opportunities for the whole partial ceasefire to break down as a result of spillover from continued military operations that affect ISIS or al-Nusra. Anyway, still a complicated situation, but one in which if we can keep the terrorism and counterterrorism side of things, as well as the other foreign policy objectives we have in the Middle East, all on the table at the same time, or not going to be on the table, they're balls that we have to be juggling. If we can do that successfully, then there might be some more improvement in Syria. Let me say a couple of general things that apply to the Middle East as a whole and the so-called Arab Spring, and then I want to do a bit of a tour d'horizon with some other places, going beyond the Iraq-Syria situation that seized our attention. The Arab Spring is a foreign policy problem, phenomenon, challenge, opportunity, call it what you want. In the eyes of most people, it was seen as an opportunity when it was first breaking out, and then more pessimism came into play, and people talked about the Arab Spring has gone backwards into an Arab winter, in that there hasn't been a whole lot of stable liberal democracy breaking out all over the Middle East. Instead, we've had situations like Syria. But I see, as far as terrorism is concerned, both positive and negative sides in general about the popular upheaval that we call the Arab Spring. On the positive side, one, there have been demonstrations, and I go back to Tahrir Square in Egypt 5 years ago, and the ouster of Hosni Mubarak. There have been demonstrations, that peaceful demonstrations, and peaceful means, not terrorism, can bring about meaningful political change. That is a major dent in the radical message that it's only when you use violence that you can achieve any kind of change that's meaningful. So that's good news. Also, to the extent that any new, more democratic channels for pursuing interests and grievances are instituted, this strengthens the case for peaceful political means and weakens further the case for violence. Now, admittedly, this is where it gets kind of gloomy when we talk about what's happened in the Arab Spring over these last 5 years. And the one place that we have to keep going back to as the favorable bit of news is Tunisia, the place where it all started in the end of 2010. In that you do have, despite all the ups and downs that Tunisia's had over these last 5 years, a more democratic political system than you had under Ben Ali when all the protests started. That said, one has to note that that does not keep individual radicals from doing something like going off and joining ISIS. And I note with chagrin that Tunisia has been one of the main sources, at least on a per capita basis, of such radicals. And I don't have a really good explanation for that, except maybe it's those who were disappointed with what the Ennahda, the Islamist movement in Tunisia, did with regard to being reasonable and being moderate and being peaceful and making compromises, that this dissatisfied some of their would-be followers who wanted to get more and didn't achieve it. Well, I'll get back to North Africa in a bit, but let me, before getting too far away from the cockpit of the Levant, let's make a couple more comments about that. Lebanon. There's been a long-standing issue of how to think about Lebanese Hezbollah in particular. We think of it first and foremost as a terrorist group, which it is. But it's much more than that. It's a major political actor in Lebanon. It is accepted as a major political actor in Lebanon by a lot of other Lebanese, as well as many others in the Middle East. Current alignments in Lebanese politics, which are very complicated, don't necessarily go along the traditional lines of sects that we think of, even though Lebanese politics is, of course, very sectarian. Some of the most important allies of Hezbollah in Lebanese politics right now are Christian groups. Hezbollah more recently has been pretty occupied with what's going on in Syria, and substantial armed elements of Hezbollah have been fighting and dying in Syria, which has become, the casualties have become somewhat of a controversy for the organization. Still more recently, you may have read that the Saudis, as part of pursuing their rivalry with Iran in particular, have announced that they are withdrawing aid from Lebanon, which had been pretty voluminous, as a way of punishing the Lebanese for continuing to let Hezbollah kind of do its thing. I don't see that that's going to really achieve Saudi objectives, and Hezbollah is certainly not going to go away. But Lebanon as a whole, again, severe internal problems with regard to the prospects for something like a new Lebanese civil war breaking out. We hope it doesn't happen. A significant foreign policy problem for outsiders, including us in the West, as well as the Saudis and the Iranians and others, in terms of how to deal with it, but certainly with major terrorist implications, given that, especially as you've got Lebanese Hezbollah involved. And then next door, you've got the Palestinians, a long story as far as terrorism is concerned that hasn't really changed, in that as long as you have a persistence of frustration of Palestinian nationalist aspirations, as well as other things that accompany military occupation by the Israelis, and a frustration of the sort of democratic aspirations that we've associated with Arab Spring elsewhere in the Middle East, you're going to have the potential for something worse in the way of violence there, including terrorist violence. And of course, what we have seen most recently over these last couple of months or more have been these individual knife attacks, not organized, clearly not coming from any central direction by any organization, but a matter of individual frustrated Palestinians, often quite young, grabbing a knife out of the kitchen and going out and stabbing the first Israeli that they could find. There's different discussion about whether this is going to lead to something more like a full-blown intifada or not. We can debate that. But if things don't get any worse, and I would not be surprised if they do get worse, but if things don't get any worse, it would only be because basically Palestinian will has been sufficiently beaten down, kind of like a broken-in horse. A sad situation. Let me say a couple of things about the Arabian Peninsula. Here's where we've got foreign policy and terrorism problems intertwining in a very complicated way, especially in Yemen. Some of the background of that conflict, which you may be aware of, we had Abdullah Ali-Saleh, who is the president, who was seen most of the time as our guy in Yemen, who had been president for some 30 years. And then, as part of the Yemen version of the Arab Spring, there were protests and uprising against him, and he was deposed. And that triggered a wider set of conflicts in Yemen, which has taken the form now of a civil war in which one side of it is represented mainly by the predominantly Shia from the north movement called the Houthis, who are allied with Saleh, the former president, against the new president who replaced him, with the backing of, in particular, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, those two Gulf Arab powers especially. And they have been waging a major war with a lot of air power and ground operations. They've just announced, the Saudis just announced, after sustaining a lot of costs in Yemen, that they're going to pull back on the ground operations, but will continue to operate in the air. Meanwhile, in terms of what this means for terrorism, the main thing that is meant, well, you've got another place for ISIS to grab into, but still the dominant group we've known as a terrorist group is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. A bunch of Yemenis and Saudis that are now based in Yemen are basically on the side, the anti-Saleh, anti-Houthi side, which is the side being supported by the Saudis and indirectly by us. But this is the same AQAP that has conducted terrorist operations against the United States. The underwear bomber, the toner cartridges, those operations.
Cole? USS Cole?
Cole was, an Al-Qaeda operation before you really had Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So we can just call that Al-Qaeda. What I'm calling AQAP is the more recent manifestation, which was originally a wholly Saudi thing, but then became Saudi and Yemeni. So I don't think, strictly speaking, we could call the Cole, which goes back as far as it did, as AQAP. It was simply Al-Qaeda. We can argue in discussion, if you want, about the U.S. policy on all this. But it's related to foreign policy in that the backing for the Saudis and what they're doing in Yemen, despite all the humanitarian and other issues that have arisen, is generally seen as, quote, compensation, unquote, for completing the nuclear agreement with Iran, which is something the Saudis don't like because they are a rival of Iran. That's only a slight oversimplification, but that's basically what it boils down to. In Saudi Arabia itself, you know, we've had a whole sequence of things that the Saudis have done on terrorism, which in turn have caused foreign policy challenges for us. Earlier on, the Saudis basically tried to export their radical violence problem. They were happy to see disaffected young radicals go off and fight the Soviets in Afghanistan, and then join the Taliban later on. They changed their approach finally in about 2003, when Riyadh itself was attacked with some radical Islamist terrorist bombings. And then the current Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Nayef, has been very much involved in this and has cooperated a lot with U.S. authorities on this. Have tried to be more constructive and more positive with regard to actually dealing with their terrorism problem. So there's that end of it, but dealing with the Saudis also means dealing with their policies toward Syria and their policies toward Yemen. And particularly on Syria, we haven't exactly seen eye to eye in terms of our priorities, as I mentioned before. I might add also, and this is really kind of looking out farther, the question of whether we need to worry about the stability of the House of Saud and what would come after it if it were to fall. And this is the great, we shouldn't speak too loudly about a topic that has been around for years and years with regard to Saudi Arabia. But I do fear that some things might be closer to coming to a head here, particularly with regard to succession politics in Riyadh. You know, we've had this long process of power going from one son to another of Abdulaziz, since he had so many of them. But now you've got King Salman, who has bestowed a whole bunch of power on his young favorite son, Mohammed bin Salman, whose project, the intervention in Yemen, is mostly his. And there are issues being raised as to whether MBS, as he's called, will actually get complete power as king when his father goes. And there surely are other elements in the royal family who would be very much opposed to, after all these years of going from one son to another of Abdulaziz, when it finally gets to the generation that comes after that, that it's King Salman who gets to decide which of the younger princes has the power. I can imagine there's going to be lots of opposition to that, which might become public in a way that will play on other discontents within the Saudi population, and the potential for radical elements to really use such disorder is significant. But I'm just raising that as a possibility. Well, final area I want to say a few things about is the whole North African area, beyond my previous comment about Tunisia. And you know, some of the basic questions about how U.S. foreign policy approaches terrorist-related issues in this part of the world came to a head in this sub-region, and particularly in Algeria, back in the early 1990s, when you had the Islamic Salvation Front, which was an Islamist group that had started scoring electoral success, competing peacefully in elections, until they got to the point where in one election in late 1991, they did so well in the first round of the election that it looked like when the second kind of runoffs were held that they would gain power. This scared a lot of people. It scared the Algerian military, which stepped in, cut short the electoral process. And what ensued was an awful period of civil war and violence in which probably something, I've seen estimates of 100 to 200,000 Algerians lost their lives. The U.S. policy perspective at the time was to basically condone the military takeover and the short-circuiting of the electoral process. The overall reasoning, which one hears again and again applied to different situations, was the specter that an Islamist group taking power peacefully would be a matter of one man, one vote, one time, meaning they wouldn't give up power peacefully even after they gained it peacefully. I think there is major ground to question that, and I would point to the example of Tunisia, in which Ennahda, the Islamist group there, did, when it started losing support and was having a hard time putting a program together and getting it through, basically voluntarily stepped down. And I think anyone who talks about the one man, one vote, one time thing has to explain the Tunisia situation. Well, anyway, as far as some of the critical North African points are concerned about, today I'm less concerned about Algeria, partly because that awful experience in the 1990s, which the vast majority of Algerians do not want to repeat, has somewhat inoculated them against violent solutions to their current problems. There's certainly political stability issues there. You've got the aged president, Bouteflika, and the role that the Le Pouvoir, the sort of behind-the-scenes collection of military and security forces that usually come under that heading, what role they play. Lots of uncertainties, but also a strong sense that we don't want to go through that horror of the 1990s again. What's more worrisome is farther east, Libya and Egypt, and those are the last two countries I'm going to talk about. Libya. I'm going to get a little personal here. Gaddafi, the former dictator, was doing, as I mentioned before when I talked about state sponsorship, an awful lot of really horrible state sponsoring things, like the bombing of Panam 103, and dealing with radical groups from the Red Army faction to the Japanese Red Army and the IRA and many others. After the bombing of Panam 103, Libya was subjected to international sanctions authorized by the United Nations Security Council. The specific demand was that Libya cough up the two prime suspects who were fingered for perpetrating the bombing in terms of actually doing the stuff on the ground to make it happen. These sanctions were in place for a number of years. They had an effect, not just economically, but politically. Gaddafi was somebody who liked to strut on the world stage, but here he was a pariah. He couldn't do this. He was isolated. He didn't like that. And so he finally coughed up the two suspects, Fima and Megrahi, who were then tried in a Scottish court. And after he coughed them up, he came through an intermediary to us and to the British and said, let's talk. I want to pursue a different course. I want to be accepted as part of the international system. I don't want to be ostracized anymore. And I'm willing to change my policies greatly to do that. And the big changes he made were, number one, getting rid of his unconventional weapons program. And he was getting into nuclear and chemical and biological and the whole slew. He didn't make a whole lot of progress, but he was making efforts. And to get out of the international terrorism business and become a partner rather than an adversary. We had, talks were started initially held in great secret, but they later become public, that I had the privilege to be involved in back in 1999 in the latter part of the Clinton administration, in which we explored our purpose and what my mission was in these first couple of rounds was to gauge the Libyan seriousness and whether they really meant to do this. I sat down with Moussa Koussa, who was Gaddafi's principal security guy. He probably had blood on his hands, possibly with Panam 103. But what they wanted to talk about was how we could share efforts against the radical Islamists that were a concern to both of us. And there are such groups that were conducted attacks in Libya, but we also consider definitely bad guy radical Islamists. My judgment was that they were serious, and after 4 more years of up and down negotiations, an agreement was reached with us, the UK, and Libya in 2003, signed under the George W. Bush administration, which finalized the whole agreement, opened up his former weapons programs, and gave the basis for the subsequent cooperation on counterterrorism. That is why, in my judgment, it was especially unfortunate, we can talk about this if you have a different view, when Arab Spring triggered violence came to Libya, especially about 5 years ago, that the decisions were made first in Western European capitals, in Paris and London especially, but then in Washington, to intervene on the side of armed rebels militarily, which we did, and that completed an overthrow of the Gaddafi regime. And then Gaddafi, remember, was caught in a ditch and bludgeoned to death. Now we have the current mess in Libya, which has been a mess all along in multiple respects. The arms and material, and Gaddafi had acquired quite an arsenal, has spread. This stuff has been showing up to the east in places like Syria and Iraq, to the south and the west in the Sahel, in places like Mali. That doesn't help as far as trying to counter radical violence is concerned. Inside Libya itself, we've had opposing governments, each claiming to be the government of Libya, one in the west in Tripoli, one in the east in Tobruk. And because of the instability and the violence, ISIS has found yet another place to take advantage of the chaos and establish a foothold. And so we now have a substantial ISIS presence along the coast in the middle of Libya, centered on Sirte, which is probably the most substantial presence, not just in the terms of claiming the name, local radicals claiming they're doing something in the name of ISIS, but an actual organizational tie, in this case probably, although we don't know for sure, with the guys in Syria and Iraq. That's a major problem. And I gave you the other background in terms of what transpired with the earlier negotiations and agreement and so on, because it also, in my judgment, the Western intervention sent an absolutely terrible message to rogue regimes elsewhere. The North Koreans, in particular, took explicit note of this, how Gaddafi had signed an agreement giving up his unconventional weapons program and so on. And then the first chance we had to overthrow him forcefully, we took the chance and we got rid of him. And the North Koreans said, we're not going to make that mistake. We're not giving up our stuff. And I think others have drawn the same conclusion. It made the negotiations with Iran somewhat harder than it would have otherwise been, I think, because of that message. Now finally, the biggest Arab country of all in terms of population, Egypt. And I think there's plenty of worry here too. All right, Egypt, a major node in foreign policy for the United States, one of the biggest recipients of U.S. assistance, really just second only to Israel. We have currently a regime led by General al-Sisi. He's taken the military uniform off, but he came out of the military, and it's basically, in that respect, like Mubarak's regime, only considerably harsher with regard to the methods that have been used against the opposition, against the press, especially against Islamists, but not wholly against them. And in the country where all those hopes of Tahrir Square came up, not only is it a matter of going back to where things were before Mubarak was overthrown, but it's also a matter of things being even worse in the eyes of many of those who are not only radicals or would-be radicals in Egypt, but those who would generally consider themselves liberals. And not surprisingly, we have seen a steady upsurge in the violence, particularly in the Sinai, but also elsewhere in the Nile Valley. in Egypt. The regime obviously depends, is relying on crushing it forcefully. And they are probably inspired by the events in the 1990s when similar terrorist violence perpetrated by the likes of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad and Jamaat al-Islamiyah was in fact quelled with security measures by about the mid-1990s. I think one of the things that's, well, two things that are different here that perhaps make that official Egyptian expectation or hope not all that well founded. One, as I said, the regime is even harsher and than the one that Mubarak led, and in that sense is fomenting even more resentment. But secondly, and this was really, I cut myself short when I made my earlier comments about the general effects of the Arab Spring on terrorism. I gave you the favorable side. There's the downside, or downsides. One is how groups like ISIS take advantage of disorder and chaos, and I've mentioned that in Libya, Syria, and so on. But the other one is that to the extent that hopes get dashed, and I think Egypt is the prime case here, hopes for greater political freedom, hopes for economic improvement. And there were such hopes of both sorts that got sky high in Egypt in the wake of Tahrir Square. To the extent those hopes cannot be realized, and the Egyptian hopes got so high that nobody could realize them, either President Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood figure who was deposed after a year, or General al-Sisi, or anyone. This, I think, makes the radical message, again, a credible sounding one. When it is said, only violence is the way to have real lasting results. You tried the nonviolent version, you got some of your way for a while, you deposed Mubarak, but then, you know, a couple years later, after the end of the Morsi presidency, you've got an even harsher military dictatorship. It doesn't work. Use violence. That's the message. And so I'm worried about that. And all of this poses a major foreign policy problem for the United States. And we've got these other equities with Egypt, having to do with the peace treaty with Israel, having to do with, you know, military access and privileged passage to the Suez Canal and so on. But we've got this problem, which gets right to the heart of international terrorism. So in conclusion, I would say, when you take full account of the foreign policy considerations, a topic that already was complicated and difficult enough, counterterrorism becomes even more complicated and difficult. Let's see what's on your mind. Be happy to have an open discussion. Yes, sir.